talk to you about entities in Drupal 8. So I will start by presenting myself. I have 1.5 year Drupal experience. I'm originally from Satu Mare, but I'm living in Cluj-Napoca. And let's start with some basics and define the concepts. We know that from Drupal 7 we have the entity API. With entity API we can add fields, not just the nodes. We have now buildable entities that make Drupal more flexible. And we have the entity types. Entity types can be viewed as a useful abstraction to group together fields. In core we have some entity types defined like nodes, comment, users, or taxonomies. And then we have bundles. Bundles are an instance of are extending the entity types, and we can attach fields to bundles. Bundles can be viewed as a package of fields. So we can have, we don't have a base table for bundle, we have a base table for entity type, and the bundles are saved just as a column in the base table of the entity type. We can add different fields for each entity type, for each bundle. Then we have fields. Fields are a reusable piece of content. They are a primitive data type, and they can be added to any bundle. Basically, the fields are added to entity type because nothing on bundle is a field, and everything on an entity type in Drupal 8 will be a field. But bundles are used just to get the configuration of the fields that they are attached to. We have in Drupal custom validators, widget parameters for the fields. We have many field types, so we can do absolutely anything, any content we have to add. Then we have the entity. It is very important that an entity is an instance of an entity type. You should not confuse it with an entity type. It is like a class and object. So, putting this in object-oriented terms, we can say that an entity type is a base class that is extended by a bundle, and we have fields that can be viewed as a class member, property, variable, or field instance, as you wish to name it. And then we have the entity that is an object or instance of the base or extended class. So back in history, in Drupal 6, what we had? We had fieldable nodes. But other things like users or comments wasn't fieldable. So there was a problem because when we had to add something on user or comment, we can't because there are no fields available for users or comments or other things like taxonomies. And the solution was to turn users and comments in nodes. That results in everything became a node. There's a problem with the performance here because everything will be stored in one single table, and if we have a lot of users, nodes, comments, will be very hard to find in that table. It will take a lot of time. Then in Drupal 7, finally we had entities. Nodes transformed to entities. We had user, comments, taxonomies, and a lot of other things created as an entity. We got the ability to create new entity types, to add bundles, to add fields for each bundle. And the result was that the field API was decoupled from nodes, finally. And the entities were created as generic STD objects. And there is a problem with that because an STD class is not a base class for objects. It doesn't have a template for an object. It is just a generic entity class. It can be very useful for anonymous objects, but it doesn't respect the open principles. We don't have methods to access the properties. It can be viewed as an array, but instead of keys we have properties here. And it was introduced later in the core development, so it was unfinished. But we got the entity module that resolved the problems. Then we had the entity API complete. And what we have now in Drupal 8. In Drupal 8, finally we have class-based entities with methods. We have specifically typed objects. So in Drupal 8, all entity types are class-based and they implement an interface. So we have well-defined properties and methods for all entity types, and we have entity types supported by handlers. Handlers like storage handlers, list handlers, or access handlers. And we have two different types of entities. We have the content entities and the configuration entities. So all the content on our site will be saved in a content entity, and all the configurations will be saved in a configuration entity. So basically everything on the site will be an entity. And let's start defining an entity type. First of all, we have to choose an ID for our entity. This ID normally starts with your module name, or must be prefixed with it, and it should be short. May not exceed 32 characters. Then we have to define an interface for our entity type. And there are two interfaces defined in the core, the config entity interface and the content entity interface. The interfaces that we define must extend these interfaces. Then we have to extend the content entity base or the config entity base and implement our interface. Add the config entity type or content entity type annotation to our class, depending on what type of entity we want to define. And add the ID label annotation, and if we have a bundle, add that bundle label annotation. In Drupal 8, some entities can have multiple bundles, others just only one. For example, the bundle label annotation is content type for nodes. We have the entity annotations, and we have the list builder. For the upcoming slides, there will be listed default handlers for each annotation. For example, for the content entity, we have the entity list builder, and the config entity, we have the config entity list builder. So the list builder, it provides an administrative overview for our entity types, and you probably want to extend that to override some methods. Like if you want to change how a row is displayed, you probably would override the build row method, or if you have an empty list and you want to display a message, you will override the render method. Then we have add and edit forms, or default forms, or default form. So we have a pass or two that extends the default base class to provide an add or edit form, add and edit form. So we can define a separate form for add and another form for edit, or we can just define a single form for the both. You can override here any method like build form, save, validate. You can use services if you want to query something, for example. You have to inject your service in the construct, a service like the query factory. Then we have the delete form. The delete form is a confirmation form for our entity delete, and you can override the question, the confirm text, what happens when you cancel the form or when you submit it. The view builder. There is a builder display a single entity. You should extend the entity view builder class. You can override a lot of things like how the whole entity is viewed or built, how the components are built, or how a field is viewed. Then the translations. For translatable content entities, you have to extend the content translation handler or just use the default, but it only will take care about that if you set the translatable annotation to true. For configuration entities, you don't have to define a handler. You can use just, it will use the configuration translation module by default. The access. So if your entity has a complex permission, you can extend the access control handler. But if you just want to keep it simple and use a single permission, you have the admin permission that will grant the root permissions for users. But if you choose to create the access control handler, you should override the check access method that will operate on view, update, and delete, and override the create access, what will operate on create. And you shouldn't override the access method, because that verifies the cache, that invokes other modules for hook permissions, and you just should let it be the default. Then we have a storage handler. For content entity, for example, we have the SQL content entity storage, and it will be the default if we don't specify another handler. And for the config entity, we have the config entity storage. You probably want to extend that to provide the custom behavior. Then the views data. A class implementing the entity views data will provide the views data for the entity type, and you can generate all of the views data with by entities class. Have the tables and keys. So the entities, the content entities are saved in a base table, where are the entity keys saved if you specify another table like the data table. So in the base table we have the content entities. For example, for the node module, I think we have the node ID, the revision ID, the universal unique ID, and the data tables will contain the base fields. We have specified another annotation, the entity keys, the properties that identifies an entity, and we have the links for our entity. Our links should take the following template: entity.entity type ID and the link templates type. For example, for the node edit, we have the entity.node.edit, and we have the typical link types: canonical, the delete form, and the edit form. The canonical is the default link to entity view, and the delete and edit form for the delete and edit. At the link annotation, we really should use that template instead of putting here the path to the form, because the path should change in time, but the root name will remain constant. Fields and bundles. We have the field UI base root, that is a route to the manage fields, manage display or manage form from the field UI module, and it can be, if you have bundles, it can be a setting page for our bundles. Then if our entity will have bundles, we should define the entity type, which for node, for example, is the node type, and if we have the bundle, we have to define the bundle of, and the entity type, for example, for the node is node. We can add additional annotations here. You can view some examples in content entities from core, for example, the node, or for configuration entities, you can see image styles or role entity. Or let's start with the entity roots. We have the roots defined in the routing YAML files. And here is a typical example for the block edit form. So we have here the root name, which is the template that we have to define for the links, the entity.block.edit form. Then we have the path. Here the block between the brackets is the machine name of our entity, and it should be used like that because when the entity is passed to the form, it will look it by that ID. So when we access an URL, the block between the brackets will take the entity ID. Then we have the defaults, entity form. We really should use that instead of controller or form because it is specifically for entities, and we have here the block default that will go to the block entity, an entity with the block ID, and we will check for the default handler. For example, we have here the default block form, so that will be the form that will take care about the edit form for the blocks. We have the title and the requirements, the entity access. That will access handler, the check access with the update operation for the account. Entity manager. To load our entities, we should use the entity manager. That is a class implementing the entity storage interface. We can retrieve the entity manager with the code, or if we have a container, we can get the service, get the storage. That you should use dependency injection to retrieve this object if it's possible. For example, in classes we can do that, in .module files we cannot. So then we have to use that code. If you want to query to find the entities, you should use the entity query. And you should use dependency injection to this object if it's possible. So in Drupal 7, the entity query had the property conditions, the conditions for the properties of the entity and conditions for the fields. But that was confusing because we didn't every time what we use, the condition or condition, and we had to check it. It takes some time. So if we know what to use at the time, it will be really great. Finally, in Drupal 8, we have only conditions. There is an example from the file entity. We have here the status and the change, and this query, the condition. You can add another conditions query like exists. You can add something integer or range if you need. Then the rendering an entity. In normal way, you just render the entity by accessing the root, but in some cases you have to run entity custom view. And then you have the computer from the entity manager. Then, if you container array, you get the service and get the computer. If you have a language, you will access the method with the entity, the view of name and the language ID. But if you just use the default language, you should leave the language ID to be empty. And just the render function. Just checking on entities, you can check the access on your operations with the entity access. But if you want to check an access on a field, you should call this method on a field. Let's start with the example, the content entity. You can see this example at the following. Problem description. We define a content entity to edit, delete the context. The content entity must be fully viewed. What can be the problem? Suppose there are for the configuration entities, blocks, and a lot of other things. So we have the content interface. I said that first of all, we have to get the ID of
sorry, but we need to change the battery in the microphone. So I said that we have to define ID to get an ID for our entity type. For example, for the content interface, we have the contact ID, and then we have to define an interface that here extends the content entity interface and the entity owner interface. The content entity interface extends other interfaces like fieldable entity interface, translatable entity interface. That's why we have then the opportunity to add fields for our entity or to translate it. The entity owner interface, it just takes care about set the owner of this entity. It has methods like set owner ID or set owner and get for these methods. Then we have the content annotations that is defined.
Thank you. So the contact annotations, they are defined in the beginning of the contact class that defines the entity. We have here the annotation, the content entity type. So we specify which type of entity we want to create. Then we have the ID, the content entity example contact, labels, the handlers. table, the contact, we have admin permissions, but we also have an access handler. If you have the both, that will check for one access from that. If the access handler returns true for an operation, or we have the administrator content entity example permission. Then we have to set it to fill the both to be true. And we have the entity keys that for every entity type should be, by default, should be the ID, the label, and the universal unique ID. Then we have the links, the canonical. In this model, there's a problem because they set the links to the path. You should set it to the root name. And we have, for example, here a custom link, the collection, that points to the list of the entity. Right. Then we have a hook, the hook entity type build. We can create entities with this hook. Here we are get the entity types array, which contains all the entity types, the config entities and the content entities from our side, and you can define another custom entity types here. That hook helped me a lot because I started to develop the entity construction kit module for Drupal 8, and I had to find a dynamically way to define new entity types. And it cannot be done with derivatives. For example, we have for the plugins, we have derivatives that give us the opportunity to create with a single class a lot of blocks, for example. But for entity types, we cannot do that, so I had to use the hook entity type build hook. The entity construction kit will be available as soon as possible, and I really hope that it will be accepted to the Google Summer of Code too. Then we have the hook entity type alter that alters the definitions of the entity type. It is very important that the core, for every alter hooks, will check if the array that we get from this hook has the same keys as the array that was passed to this hook. And if there are some new keys, it will return an exception. So for creating new entity types, we have to use the hook entity type build, only if we have to do some custom definitions for our entity type, custom dynamic definitions. But if we have those data that we need to create an entity type, we should use the annotation form. Then we have the contact base class that extends the content entity base and implements the contact interface. And for example, here we have a quick create function that gets the entity storage interface and values before that is called before the entity is persisted. That calls for the function from the parent, and then adds the user ID, the current user ID, to the values array. So entity types are saved in a base table for the contact entity. We have the contact table. But from where the schema is coming from for that table. The schema is coming from the base field definitions. And we have to define the base field definitions for our entity type, because if we didn't do that, we doesn't have the table. The entity type doesn't know how to define the table. So we have the ID here, the universal unique ID, the name, first name. So everything that in Drupal 7 you used to store as property for your entity. Then we have the access handler. Here we have a simple example. We have the check access where the entity is passed, the operation, the line code, and the account. Then checks for each case the view, edit, and delete, and returns if the user has certain permission. Then we have the check create access that checks for another permission. These two functions were separated because when we want to create an entity, we doesn't have the entity. So at the check create access, the entity isn't passed to that method. But for the check access, we have the entity already defined. So configurations in Drupal 7. In Drupal 7, we have a lot of problems with the configuration. You get a module, you do something with that, and then you have to get your configurations to the production. But there was a problem because we did it with features, and not every module had feature support. This problem is resolved in Drupal 8 because we have finally configuration entities, and all configurations can be exported in configuration entities. So, the difference between the configuration entity and the content entity is that the configuration entities uses the configuration system for storage. It doesn't use the database or the SQL storage, for example. Everything on a content entity is a field, and nothing on a configuration entity is a field. We have a lot of configurations saved in YAML files, like the routines, like the schema, that are all configurations. Then we have in core, for examples, as configuration entity the content types, the views, taxonomy, vocabularies, contact forms, image styles. It's very important the configuration entities are not fieldable. But if we want to add fields for a content entity, we have to define a bundle for that, and that bundle is a configuration entity. But the fields aren't attached to the bundle, they are attached to the entity type, but the bundles are just knows which fields are belonging to them. So there is like they categorize the fields. So creating a configuration entity. We have to define the interface that extends the config entity interface, and we can add other methods for our entity here. Then we have the class. We define the annotations, the config entity type, ID, label, handlers, the entity keys, the permissions, the config prefix. That is very important because here we specify which storage the configuration entity will use. For example, we have there the config prefix example that when we want to check all entities stored in an example storage, it will reload all the entities, all the example config entities. Then we have the class that extends the config entity base and implements the example interface, where we define all the properties that this entity type will have, like ID and label. You can add another properties which you want here. Then we have the configuration schema. For config entities, there is no such base fields to get the schema of the entity type, but we have to define this in the schema.yaml file. So here we have the name example, that is the module name. Then we have dot example, that is the storage name, and the dot and the wildcard that can match everything, every entity. It will be stored as this example, as this root name. Then we have the type, that is the config entity, the label, and the mapping. We define these properties, the ID and the label. So here we should put the ID and the label as the mapping. Then we have the entity form class. That extends the entity form, that is the base class for entity forms. We have the constructor, where we have the query factory that is injected with dependency injection. We set here which service we want in the create method. So here in the create method, we have the container interface, which passes the container. Then from the container, we can get the service, the entity query, and before this class is instantiated, the create method will be called because it is a static method, and then the result will be passed to the constructor. Then we have the form, where we specify how the form would be viewed. We have here the label, the ID. You can set other things here if you have other properties. We have the save method, and you have like this method that only checks if our entity is already exists. It will check for the entity ID. So conclusions. Because Drupal 8 will be released soon, it's good to know that we have futable content entities, and we have all configurations stored in config entities. So basically, if you look in the core, entities are everywhere. Some questions?
You should ask questions, because I have 3 PHP licenses to give you away, and until now, no one asked them.
Can I have one?
Yeah.
The question was if we can have a license.
And the answer was yes. We already know.
Nothing? Okay, then thank you.